Good,
Hi.
how are you?
Yeah, great, thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be able to speak to you today because I'm a huge, huge fan of this show. And I wanted to start off, I think, importantly, to ask about Shawna, because obviously sad to lose her on this great project and what you both learned from working with her that maybe you'll carry forward in your respective careers. Devin, you want to start?
Okay. Basically, I learned that, well, Shauna's big thing was making sure to get people into the union. She literally wanted to pass the information on to what everybody was in terms of like making sure that we had people who understood the craft, who um who wanted to be in this business and to give them an opportunity. And I would say that is the biggest takeaway that I have from Shawna is to pulling people up behind you. E.
Yeah, sort of the same thing. I mean, all of us, Shawna definitely hand selected the team, but in a way that she brought people in that she knew were passionate about what it was that she did or what we did and for the project itself. But the other thing that she did that I really, really liked was she believed in what she liked to say was an equal playing field, that we were all equals and that we were all sort of a part of this project and that we could all throw ideals at each other, that there was no hierarchy. Like she didn't sit at the top, she was equal with us, and that she wanted to sort of collaborate with us and work with us as artists. And she called us her artist, which is it meant a lot to a lot of our crew. And so this, she would tell you if she was here that this was a true collaboration between her and her crew and between Dave and everyone. Oh, that's amazing to hear. I'm really pleased to hear that. And there's some phenomenal costumes throughout this series, but I wanted to start with Ahsoka's and the white costume she wears when she comes back from the World Between Worlds. So could you both maybe talk about the evolution of that look for her? And I know it's one that a lot of people have compared to going from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White.
E, go ahead.
For sure. I mean, that was definitely an inspiration and something that we had as an actual like meme that Shauna printed out and put up on a wall. But that was definitely a huge collaboration between Dave, Shauna, Doug, and Rosario, who all kind of gave their inputs. Rosario especially wanted the costume to sort of evolve with her. And so she was very involved in sort of like the lines and the way that they changed in the bodice, and how she could move a little bit differently. And then with that too, Shauna definitely still wanted to incorporate bits of pieces of sort of, resembling the gray costume. So we did have a new cape that was woven, hand woven. So we still carried on sort of, the reminiscent of the gray, but into the white that then evolved into more details and more, it evolved and everyone had a huge part in it. So yeah. Yeah, and same for you as well, Devon, in terms of working on that costume.
Yep, I would say that's exactly.
Oh, amazing. And on talking of Ahsoka, obviously when we go into those flashbacks, we see her and Hayden Christensen's Anakin in those Clone War costumes, which obviously people would be familiar with from the animated shows. So for both of you again, how challenging was it to translate those from animation to live action and do so in a way that's obviously going to make the fans happy? From day one, I mean, Shauna always has loved the fans from everything she's always done. And she's always very grateful to the fans. And we consider the fans when we are making things as well. We always talk about them as we're actually making them. But with going from animated to live action, there is definitely this sort of, well, how can we take inspiration from the costume and what can we pull from the animation into the live action that is still practical? So how do we make it practical? Because obviously you can't go from sort of a animated character to live action and make it exact, because there's certain things in animation that just isn't practical for a living human body. But we definitely wanted to make sure that we always paid respect to the animated character, and seeing as how like Shawna was such a huge fan of Rebels and the Clone Wars, and so was like a good chunk of our crew, we definitely made sure that we had, if it wasn't an exact almost reproduction of what it was in the animation, we wanted to pay respect and do honor to the fans. So, and I think we managed to do that. So
Yeah, Devon, would you agree with that in terms of translating those costumes, and then again ones for characters like Hela and Sabine as well?
I would say yes. And Shauna literally, whenever she did something, she always had the fans in mind. So it was like, how would the fans relate to this? So her whole thing, I mean, Shauna like adored the fans and wanted to make sure that the fans were happy. I mean, that was one of Shauna's big things, because she always got so much love from the fans, especially when she would go to any of the events like Comic-Con or D23. And they would always like give her inspiration. And so as she looked at everything, she's like, what's going to make the fans happy? Like, how do we make this work so it stays true to the animation, but also stays true to the universe and stays true to the fans?
Oh, fantastic. And a costume I know as a fan myself, a lot of us were really going over with a fine tooth comb was Thrawn's uniform, because, on the surface it looks as you would expect, but then when you start looking closer, there's little defects and we see it's a bit scuffed up. So could you both talk through the process of creating that look and telling the story with the costume as well, which I thought was really cool?
So with Thrawn and sort of with everyone that's on that ship, they've been on this planet for a long time, and they don't necessarily have access to new uniforms or a way to necessarily fix it. But as fans from the series and who know Thrawn, they know how meticulous and how like he's very all about presentation. So for us, we had to show that this costume had, gone through this period of time, but we also had to show it in a way that would show that Thrawn took care of his costume. So like there may have been, his costume may have started getting some holes in it because it's made from a fabric that would have gotten holes in it over time and depending on the weather and how it was stored. But Thrawn would have taken the time to fix his costume. So you see those little details of how he would have come in and then fixed it. So that was sort of that story.
And for you, Devon, talking of Thrawn, he's surrounded by those stormtroopers as well. And, we see they're undead and they're broken and they're held together with that red light tape, which is such a cool visual. And obviously the different color armors as well on them. What was it like to work on stormtroopers, but in a way we haven't seen in Star Wars before?
Well, I will say that Shauna really wanted to Kansuki, the gold that you see is the Kansuki method, and Shauna actually really did her research because she wanted to find something that was sort of unique. And she was like, well, they're broken, but this method kind of sort of joins it together and brings some depth into it. And in relation to the red fabric, that's the touch of the witches. So, because if you notice, the witches are all in red. And so it's the witches that are also keeping them together. So it just kind of sort of shows you like Thrawn's power and how he is in relation to these are Thrawn's troopers, but the witches are helping him to maintain his troopers through life and technically through death.
Awesome. You mentioned the witches there. So again, both of you, how much fun was it to bring those great mothers to life? And they're such unique characters, and those costumes, I think, really jump off the screen as well.
They were so much fun. And we actually got to have like 3 separate teams work on them. Not as like competition or anything like that, but we actually got to have 3 distinct tailoring groups that worked on each of them. And again, Shawna collaborated with each group, and she'd be like, okay, let's try this here. Or like, what do you feel about this? Or our tailor would be able to come back and be like, well, how do you think if I maybe did this instead of this? And she would always be like, yes, let's try it. And then, but within those 3 groups, all 3 of them then had to work together to make sure that there was consistency in the costumes, and that they did have sort of similarities, because they are the 3 great mothers. And so they had to be, you know, different, but at the same time, the same. So I know our teams also had a lot of fun working on them, and like getting to collaborate and talk about how they were building them and coming up with new methods of how they were going to do things.
And Shawna did a lot of research. She had a lot of images that she presented to the teams in terms of her research to say like, hey, like we want them to be able to flow, because David Filoni, one of his favorite words is flow. So he wants things to be able to move. And so she also went into that with, we need to make sure that as the witches move, their dress moves. It kind of sort of like as make it as ethereal to a certain degree as possible. And that was, and also because they were there, they couldn't be brand spanking new. They needed to be aged as well because of their years and being on that particular planet and basically what's happening on the surface of that planet.
Yeah, we always had a fan in our fitting room that we could plug in, and then Shawna would take the fan and move it around to make sure that our costumes flowed. And then she would usually video record it, or Dave would be there and Dave would get to see it. So yeah, we had fans in the fitting room.
Oh, that's awesome. And, you know, another character who gets a real startling new look, I think, is Ezra. It's been a long time since we've seen him, and it's a completely different kind of style to what we saw in Star Wars Rebels. So, spoke again for both of you. What did you enjoy about coming up with a new look, that new look for him, and getting it to fit the actor in the way that it does? Because he looks great when he's in action, in particular, I thought.
Uh, Ezra was really important for us because, like you said, it's a brand new costume, and the fans had, you know, their memory of what Ezra was before he sort of disappears. And we don't even have anything that's semi reminiscent of his old costume, of his old look. But we still needed to make sure that it was Ezra. But then he also had to, you know, so we still wanted to have sort of this like, he put the costume himself together from, you know, the materials that he found on this planet. So they needed to look like they were from the planet, but also they still needed to look like something that Ezra himself would put together and would consider all of the pieces. So he would have some armor because he's on a planet where, you know, there's enemies there, and he doesn't know if he's going to have to get in a scrap of some kind. But they were going to be found pieces that he found amongst the locals, or found amongst the plant life and stuff like that. But the costume also, I think it was important for us to sort of have this, you know, look of being Jedi-esque without them being just Jedi robes. So definitely inspired by Jedi, because, you know, Ezra would have thought about that as he was making his clothes, but then, you know, making sure they were comfortable.
Yeah, and you know, Elissa mentioned there, Devon, that obviously Ezra saw some action, as do a lot of the characters in this show. So when it comes to coming up with costumes that are suitable for action scenes, does that make things more difficult in terms of how you realize them from the concept art to actually getting them on the actors?
Well, not so much. I mean, because we understand which fabrics have stretch in them and which don't.
Yeah.
So we try to find things that do have some stretch that could work. Or, you know, sometimes if there's just a fabric that we feel really works for a character, gussets work wonders. But for the most part, we did try to find fabrics that had stretch to them, that were durable, that looked like that they could hold up. Because as we know, most people in Star Wars don't really change clothes. So we have to make sure that they're wearing something that could like literally literally last through the test of time. And actually, there are some durable fabrics out there that work well for us for that.
Oh,
The the other thing Shawna wasn't just a collaborator within our own department. She was a collaborator with all departments. So one of the things that was really important for Shawna, because she understood that these costumes not only had to flow, but they had to be able to move. And we are a stunt heavy show. So in the very beginning, from day one, we were meeting with stunts and we had a binder for them of all of the costumes that were going to need stunts. And we had the sketches in there. And we sat down with our stunt team and we're like, hey, this is what we need to do. We want your guys' input of how you think maybe, you know, we need to rig this costume so you guys can have the correct movement. Or do you know what it is they're going to be doing? Like what sort of tumbles and what sort of kicks and like what do we need to consider as we are building this costume? So stunts was very involved in our process. And one of the favorite things that we always had any of our actors, not just our stunt performers, but our actors as well, do when they would come in for fittings is we would do what was called the squat test to make sure that they could move in their costume. So movement was a really big, important aspect that Shawna considered from day one. And we built costumes with that in mind.
So interesting to hear about that process. And, you know, we talked about, you know, some returning fan favorites, but of course we get three new characters here with Baylan, Shin, and Marok. So to work on characters like that and to add them to this Star Wars lore, can you both talk a little bit about their looks and the stories you wanted to tell with their costumes?
Well, for Marok, Shawna had a cast iron. She felt her inspiration for him was cast iron, because she felt it was strong and durable, just like that character, even though he does, well, we all know what happens to him in the show. But the way, and then it did take a lot, it took a series of processes to get that character to look that way. And that was a collaboration with multiple specialty custom made teams to try to get that finish on that armor to look that way. And she was very happy with the way it came out. I would say, speaking for that particular character.
And that was definitely one that we knew who the stunt performer was pretty much going to be from day one. And it was Paul Darnell. And so we were able to involve him and the choreographer in the build of that, because obviously he has to be able to see through that helmet. And so we were really able to work with the stunt performers as well. And they were able to give an input from like process to process to process. So we were able to make sure that that costume worked immaculately when it was time for it to be worn on screen. For Shin and Baylan, those costumes were two that we had sketches from pretty much from day one from both Dave and Doug. But with them, with Shawna talking to Dave, Dave really wanted the two of them to look like they were travelers, that they had been wearing these costumes for who knows how long, but that they should look like they have you know, wear and tear in them, that they've been in battles that we don't know where they came from, but that their costumes should sort of tell this story, give this backstory, because we don't get backstory for them, but their costumes should hint at their backstory. So for Shawna, it was really important for her to sort of have tell a story, and she was able to do that, I think, with the different fabric choices that she had. There's so many different fabrics involved in those costumes, and sort of adding texture. And then also like with Ray, he came in day one in his fitting and he was like, I want to incorporate this space stone that I found and I wanted it in my costume. And of course Shawna was like, oh my gosh, yes, let's do it. And she then took from, Ray was only supposed to have a ring with the stone in it. That's all he asked for. But we took that and we incorporated this green color of this stone in throughout the costume. So he's got on his armor, he's got this green sort of tint to it. And in his clothing, there's green marks on it. And then as well as we actually took the stone and we had one of our custom made tailors, actually, she did a Viking knot. And throughout the Viking knot, there's pieces of the little stone in actually throughout his costume. It's mainly on his vest, but it's also on trim pieces and stuff. So Shawna always, even if like fans don't get to see it, and even if you don't see it on screen, it was really important for Shawna to tell the full story of this character in their clothing, and the actor knew it was there, so it would help them as well really get into character.
Amazing. And just one final question for you both. You know, we talked about Thrawn and those small details on his costume, but I know fans love finding those hidden details on costumes and something you really need to go looking for. But do both of you have a favorite hidden detail on any of the characters' costumes that maybe you wouldn't see at first glance, but it's something important, like what you mentioned with Balin's green in his costume?
Hmm.
Something I think is cool, and I don't actually think you see on any of the witches, is all three of them have sort of like what we called like their witches pouch. So like Shawna was like, oh, this is where all of their little like gadgets that they would need to cast spells if they were to pull something out is on their costume. So all of them have these sort of like little pieces that are fabric that's wrapped and has string on it, and there's stuff hanging from it, and all of them have it on their costume somewhere, and they're all in different places. But those were really important for Shawna to do, because she's like, they're witches, they gotta have something that they could be able to like pull out and be like, oh, let me just cast a spell really quick. So like stuff like that. And even though that's not necessarily how, you know, the witches powers work, Shawna was like, they would have something that they would store something in there for them that they might need. And so on the witches, we do have these little pouches that I think you can see some of them, but they're in various places. Like I know one of them has it on the hood, one of them has it on the belt, and I don't remember where the third one is, but all three of them have one.
And for you, Devin, anything that stands out to you?
I mean, actually, it would have been Balin's. That would have been for me. That would have been my hidden feature. But yes.
Awesome. Oh, well, congratulations to you both for your work on the series and obviously the work you did with Shawna. I think the three of you came up with something really special. And as a fan myself, to see Hayden in that Clone Wars uniform, that was a highlight. But then so was every other costume. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk about the show.
Yeah.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having us.